May 19th, 1971. Harmony Creek, Georgia. The air was thick with the smell of rain and damp red clay. 7 in the morning. Sam Jones was wrestling his old pickup truck down a dirt road that cut a line between two worlds, the dense, dark pines on one side and the sprawling vineyard on the other. He slammed on the brakes, the truck groaning to a halt. He killed the engine. The sudden silence was broken only by the drip of water from the trees. He stepped out of the cab, his worn boots sinking into the mud, and looked down. There, in a gully carved by the relentless rains of the past week, lay a human skull. It was yellowed and stained, with dark soil still packed into the hollows where eyes once were. Sam stared at it for a long, silent 10 seconds. Then his gaze lifted, tracing the neat, disciplined rows of grapevines that stretched across 2 acres, their leaves heavy with young fruit. This was the famous Harmony Creek Vineyard, home to an amber grape so sweet, so perfect, that boxes of it were shipped to the finest restaurants in Chicago and New York every year. Tastes like honey, but better, the folks in the county would say. Sam looked from the skull back to the vineyard. A wave of nausea washed over him, cold and sudden, because a single, horrifying thought had just connected in his mind. This was the same vineyard whose grapes he had eaten every single year for the past 9 years. Everyone in town ate them. They bought them from 2 women, Mary and Jane, a pair of widowed friends, the best grape growers in the state. They had plaques, awards, their picture in the Times Atlanta Journal-Constitution asterisk. Their grapes were always the sweetest, always the biggest. The county agent would visit, shake his head in wonder and ask, "What in God's name are you feeding these vines?" Gold dust. And the women would just smile and stay silent. In 3 weeks, investigators would unearth the remains of 14 people from beneath that vineyard. Some of the bodies had been there so long that the roots of the vines had grown through their rib cages, drawing life from their decay. But that would come later. Right now, on May 19th, 1971, Sam Jones was just a farmhand standing over a skull, completely unaware that his discovery would unearth a secret that would not only bury 2 women, but would also shatter an entire town's faith that they ever truly knew their neighbors at all. The most disturbing realization was yet to dawn on the town. The grapes they had savored for 9 years had been fertilized by the town's darkest secrets. In the early 1960s, Harmony Creek was the kind of place that seemed to exist outside of time. A handful of houses, a church, and a general store were scattered along a dusty road that followed a meandering creek. Life was slow, governed by the seasons and the Sunday sermon. It was a town of white picket fences and hushed gossip, a place where everyone knew your name, your business, and your grandfather's middle name. But beneath that placid surface of southern charm, a darkness was taking root. It was centered on a 2-acre plot of land on the edge of town, a vineyard that had been there since before the war but had only recently become a source of immense local pride. Its success was the work of 2 women, Mary Asher and Jane Miller. They were widows, friends since childhood, and figures of quiet respect in the community. They were seen as symbols of resilience, 2 lonely women who, through sheer hard work and determination, had turned a neglected patch of dirt into a Garden of Eden. But the paradise they cultivated was fed by the bodies of the damned, and the sweet fruit it bore was a testament to a terrible, hidden justice. Asterisk, asterisk, number. The backstory. Asterisk, asterisk. To understand how 2 acres of heaven became a graveyard, we have to go back 9 years to 1962 to a small clapboard house on the edge of town where 32-year-old Mary Asher was looking at her husband for the very last time. Harmony Creek back then was just 43 homes, most of them simple farmhouses with screen doors that slammed shut in the humid summer breeze. Electricity had only arrived in '59, and television was a luxury only the farm's owner could afford. The town was connected to the county seat by 12 miles of dirt road, and the bus only came twice a week, weather permitting. The vineyard itself, 2 acres of a sweet pink varietal, was part of a larger family-owned farm. It had been neglected for years until 1958, when two women asked the owner, Mr. Henderson, if they could work the plot themselves, Mary Asher and Jane Miller. Friends since they were girls running barefoot through the Georgia pines. Both had married young in the 40s, and both, the town believed, had lost their husbands in the war. They were both childless and lived in adjacent houses right where the town ended and the vineyard began. Mary was the elder by 3 years. She was tall for a woman of that time, nearly 5'7", with a wiry, sun-dried strength. Her hands were knotted and calloused, hands that looked like they belonged to a man who worked the earth. Her face was dark from the sun, weathered, with deep lines etched around her eyes. She spoke little, but when she did, her words were sharp and direct. The other women in town were a little afraid of her, not because she was mean or loud, but because an unshakable coldness emanated from her, a stillness that had nothing to do with the weather. Jane Miller was her perfect opposite. Soft, rounded, with a warm smile that never seemed to leave her face. She was the one who baked apple pies for the church bake sale, the one who always had a kind word for a neighbor, the one whose kitchen always smelled of cinnamon and coffee. Children adored her, running to her back door for the dried apricots she always kept in a jar. Where people shied away from Mary, they were drawn to Jane. She had a gift for making a person feel welcome, for drawing them in. The two women complemented each other like a hammer and an anvil. One drew you in, the other brought the strike. But no one in Harmony Creek knew that. To them, they were just two lonely, hard-working women who toiled from sunrise to sunset in their vineyard, bothering no one. And that vineyard was their life. They rose at 4 in the morning, before the Georgia sun turned the air to soup. They weeded, they pruned, they hauled water from the creek. In the blistering heat of the afternoon, they would rest in their shaded homes, only to emerge again as evening approached. This was their rhythm, day after day, from March to October. The results weren't immediate. For the first couple of years, the harvest was average. But starting in 1962, something changed. The vines exploded with life. The clusters grew heavier, the grapes sweeter. An agricultural consultant from the county, a man named Peter Kowalchuk, would come every fall, feel the weight of the grapes in his hand, and just shake his head. Mary, Jane, what are you putting in this soil? On the next plot over, the grapes are tiny. Yours look like jewels. Are you fertilizing with gold dust? Jane would just offer her gentle smile while Mary remained silent, eventually saying, "Just chicken manure, Mr. Kowalchuk." And wood ash. Nothing special. He never believed them, but he couldn't argue with the results. Then, in October of 1962, it all began. Earl Asher, Mary's husband, hadn't died in the war. He had come back from Korea a decorated hero on the outside, but a broken man on the inside. A piece of shrapnel had left him with crippling headaches, sleepless nights, and a rage that could ignite without warning. The doctors prescribed rest. He found his own medicine, moonshine. By 1961, Earl was no longer working. He was a ghost who haunted their small house, his only purpose to drink until he passed out or exploded. The town tolerated him out of a mixture of pity and respect. He was a veteran, after all. But at home, Mary's tolerance had run out long ago. Earl beat her. Not every day, but every week. It could start over anything. Supper was too hot, supper was too cold. A look she gave him, a word she didn't say. The neighbors knew. They heard the shouting. They saw the bruises she tried to hide with long sleeves and high collars. But they never interfered. A man's home was his castle. What happened between a husband and a wife was their own business. A Southern woman endures. So Mary endured for 7 years. Once, she left and stayed with Jane for a week. Earl came to the door, sober and crying, begging her to come home. She believed him. 3 days later, he got drunk and broke 3 of her ribs. She spent 2 weeks in the county hospital, telling the doctors she fell down the stairs. her, but they wrote it down anyway. The sheriff never came to ask questions. There was no complaint filed. It was a family matter. When Mary returned home, Earl was waiting for her on the porch, sober but sullen. "I'm leaving tomorrow," he said. "Going to find work up in the mines in Kentucky. They're paying good money." Mary just nodded. She knew there were no mines, no job waiting in Kentucky. She knew because she had spent the entire previous night talking with Jane. And that night, Mary had made a decision that would change everything. On October 18th, 1962, Earl Asher did indeed leave for Kentucky. That's what Mary told the neighbors. That's what she told everyone who asked. He went to work in the mines. He'll be sending money soon. But the money never came. The letters never came. After 6 months, people stopped asking. He was gone. And that was that. One less drunk in town. And for the first time in 7 years, Mary Asher slept through the night. She slept without the fear of a key turning in the lock, without the dread of fists and angry words. She slept soundly, because Earl was lying 10 feet from her house, buried beneath a young grapevine that she and Jane had planted the very night they put him in the ground. Jane had come over after dark, bringing a mason jar of potent moonshine and a bowl of pickled okra. She knew Earl wouldn't refuse. He drank it greedily, telling some rambling war story. Jane listened, smiled, and kept his glass full. Mary sat in the corner, waiting. The moonshine was laced with a triple dose of barbiturates Jane had gotten from the pharmacist in town, claiming her nerves were shot. Earl passed out 40 minutes later, his head slumping onto the table. Jane checked for a pulse and then nodded to Mary. What came next was Mary's work alone. Jane couldn't do it. Her hands were shaking too badly. She went outside and stared up at the stars while Mary did what needed to be done. The axe was an old one, with a cracked handle Earl himself had once sharpened. 2 quick, precise blows to the back of the head. He never woke up. They dug the grave together. A frantic, silent task that lasted until dawn. They wrapped the body in an old blanket, lowered it into the earth, and covered it over. On top, they planted the new vine. When the sun rose, there was no trace of the grave, just another row in their vineyard. Mary stood leaning on the shovel, looking at the freshly turned earth. Her hands weren't shaking. She didn't cry. She didn't pray. She just thought, finally, it's over. Jane came and stood beside her. In the quiet of the morning, Jane whispered, "Mine, too." Mary turned and looked into her friend's eyes. She understood immediately. Carl Miller, Jane's husband, was no better than Earl. He drank. He hit, maybe not as often, but just as hard. He'd once slammed Jane's head against the wood stove, leaving a scar on her forehead she would carry for the rest of her life. She told everyone she'd slipped. No one believed it, and no one did a thing. Mary nodded silently. They both knew what had to happen next. Carl Miller left for a construction job in Florida in February of 1963. He, too, never wrote or sent money. He, too, was never looked for. They buried him 20 yards from Earl. They used the same shovel. The vine they planted over him came from the same nursery. 2 husbands, 2 rows of grapes, and 2 women who were finally free. That spring, the vines in those 2 rows grew with an unnatural vigor. The grapes were larger, juicier than any others. Mary and Jane both saw it, and they both understood the same terrible truth. The earth loves meat, and if 2 bodies could produce such a harvest, what would happen if there were more? For the next 2 years, life was quiet. Mary and Jane worked, their vineyard flourished, and their reputation grew. They were praised at town meetings, held up as examples of hard work and fortitude. The 2 war widows who didn't complain, who just got the job done, no one knew that their success was being fed by the bodies of their husbands. And then, in the spring of 1966, the town got a new sheriff. Sheriff Miller was a young man, only 32, sent down from Atlanta to this rural backwater after some trouble with his superiors. He was a stout man with a round face and small, darting eyes. From his first day, he made it clear who was in charge, making his rounds, asking questions and dropping hints that keeping the peace came at a price. The town understood. The farm owner sent him a sack of potatoes and a bottle of whiskey every month. Others paid in produce or moonshine. It was the way things worked. You stay on the right side of the law. But Sheriff Miller had other appetites. He cornered a young bookkeeper, Annie Bell, late one night, offering her a ride she didn't want. He let her go. But the story spread in whispers. Women in town learned to avoid being alone with him. The men stayed silent. Complaining about the sheriff was a fool's errand. Mary heard the story from Jane, who'd heard it from a neighbor. Vulture was the only word Mary said. Jane knew what that word meant coming from her friend. It was only a matter of time. The moment arrived in September of 1966. A long-haul trucker from out of state named Tom Jenkins was passing through. He got drunk at the general store, and on his way out of town, he saw Annie Bell walking home from the school library. She was just 14. What happened next was a crime the whole town knew about, but no one would speak of aloud. When Annie stumbled home, brutalized and broken, her mother's screams echoed through the quiet evening. Sheriff Miller was called. He took a brief report, shook his head, and said the driver would be impossible to find. He advised the family to keep quiet about it. Who's going to want to marry a girl once a story like that gets out? He'd said. The case was closed. The official report said the encounter was consensual. Annie stopped leaving the house. She stopped speaking. The town knew. The town did nothing. A week later, Tom Jenkins came back. He was a regular on that route. He stopped at the general store, bought a bottle of whiskey, and asked the clerk where a man could find a room for the night. The clerk, knowing Jane sometimes rented her spare room, sent him to her house. Jane met him at the door with a warm smile. She invited him in, sat him at her kitchen table, and served him a plate of fried chicken and a glass of sweet tea, which she then followed with a mason jar of her special moonshine. Jenkins ate and drank, boasting and laughing. Jane listened, smiled, and kept his glass full. 2 hours later, he was slumped over the table, snoring heavily. The moonshine was spiked with the same barbiturates that had put Earl Asher to sleep. Mary arrived after dark. She looked at the sleeping man, recognizing him from the neighbors' descriptions. The same axe that had served them twice before was waiting by the door. They buried him in the far corner of the vineyard, under the youngest vines, deeper than the others. Jane's truck was used to drive his rig into a ravine outside of town, where it would join a few other rusted-out vehicles, unnoticed for years. After Jenkins, something shifted. It was no longer about self-preservation. It became a system, a quiet, brutal form of justice. They weren't hunting victims. They were simply waiting, and people came to them. Sheriff Miller was the fourth. By January of '67, his corruption and lechery had grown bolder. He began visiting Jane, enjoying her tea and her company. One cold night, he showed up at her door with a bottle of cheap whiskey, ready to collect the favors he believed he was owed. Jane let him in. Mary was waiting in the next room. When the sheriff was passed out from the drugged moonshine, Mary emerged. In her hands, she held his own set of handcuffs. They snapped them onto his wrists before delivering the final blows. 4 years later, when the rains washed him up, the handcuffs were still there, rusted and fused to his bones. The fifth was Mr. Davison, an abusive foreman from the Maine farm. He was known for his cruelty, especially to the female workers. Jane was assigned to his crew for a few weeks during the cotton harvest and experienced his heavy-handed abuse herself. One night, he showed up at her house, drunk and demanding. He never left. 6th and 7th were the Carter brothers, 2 local thugs who had terrorized the town for years. After they robbed and beat an elderly widow named Old Lady May for her pension money, a crime that went unpunished, they made the mistake of showing up at Jane's door one night, drunk and looking for trouble. They didn't know Mary was waiting for them in the dark with an axe. They were buried together in a single, wide grave. The 8th was a con man from Atlanta who swindled half the town. The ninth was the only woman, Mrs. Gable, who ran the general store. She was a notorious gossip and informer, a woman who had ruined lives with her malicious whispers and letters to the authorities. When she grew suspicious of the vineyard's success and started threatening to report Mary and Jane, Jane invited her over for tea to smooth things over. Mrs. Gable was buried in the rockiest, most barren part of the vineyard. The grapes above her will be sour, Mary had said. From 10 to 14, the victims were a blur of transient men, drifters, salesmen, travelers. Each one had made a fatal error. They had been cruel. They had been violent. They had threatened one of the women, or someone the women felt compelled to protect. The system was now brutally efficient. Jane was the lure, the warm smile that promised comfort. Mary was the hammer, the silent, swift instrument of death. And the vineyard grew, its fruit becoming legendary. By the spring of 1971, 14 bodies enriched the soil of those 2 acres. 14 souls feeding the sweetest grapes in Georgia. Then, in May of 1971, the heavens opened. A storm of biblical proportions settled over Georgia for 3 solid weeks. The creeks overflowed their banks, the dirt roads turned to rivers of red mud, and the water clawed at the land. The vineyard, situated on a gentle slope, began to bleed its soil downhill. The torrents of water washed away the topsoil, then the layer beneath that until it finally exposed what had been hidden for so long. After Sam Jones found the first skull, the town's lone deputy arrived, followed by the farm owner. By evening, a team of investigators from the state capitol in Atlanta was on the scene. The excavation began. It was slow, meticulous work, more like an archaeological dig than a crime scene investigation. On the second day, they found the first complete skeleton, still clothed in the tattered remains of a work shirt and boots. A belt buckle identified him, Mr. Davison, the foreman who had moved away in the fall of '68. Nearby, another skeleton, this one with fractures on the skull and a tarnished sheriff's badge in the pocket of what was once a pair of trousers. Sheriff Miller. And on his wrists, the rusted handcuffs. Detective Evans, a veteran homicide investigator from Atlanta, arrived on the 3rd day. He was a man who thought he had seen everything the darkest corners of human nature had to offer. He was wrong. He stood at the edge of the vineyard, a cigarette dangling from his lips, watching as his team pulled another set of bones from the earth. The roots of the vines were everywhere, thick and white against the dark soil. He watched as they documented a root that had threaded its way through the eye socket of a skull, another that had wrapped itself around a spinal column. The vineyard was literally feeding on the dead. Evans suddenly remembered tasting these very grapes a couple of years prior at a dinner party. "Try these," his host had urged. "They're like nothing you've ever had. Sweet as honey." The memory made him physically ill. He turned away, walked behind one of the police cruisers, and wretched. When he composed himself, he walked back to the scene and asked the question that was on everyone's mind. Who owns this plot of land? They pointed him toward 2 small houses at the edge of the property, the homes of Mary Asher and Jane Miller, the hard-working widows, the pillars of the community. "Bring them in," Evans said, his voice flat. They found Mary in the field. Despite the circus of police cars and flashing lights, she was working, tending to the vines, as if it were just another day. When the deputies approached her, she simply straightened up, wiped the dirt from her hands, and looked at them with a calm, unreadable expression. "Let's go," the deputy said. She just nodded and walked with them. They arrested Jane in her kitchen. The room was filled with the warm, comforting smell of a baking apple pie. When they entered, she simply asked, "Can I take the pie out of the oven first? It'll burn." They let her. She slid the perfectly browned pie onto the counter, wiped her hands on her apron, and followed them out the door. The first interrogation took place that evening. Detective Evans sat across a metal table from Mary Asher. She sat perfectly still, her calloused hands folded in her lap. Her eyes were dark and deep. and she met his gaze without a hint of fear. "Mary Asher," he began, reading from the file. "Your husband, Earl Asher, where is he?" She didn't hesitate. "Under the vineyard. First row from the road, third vine on the left." Evans was stunned into silence. He had expected denials, tears, a complete breakdown. Not this. Not this cold, factual statement. "You're admitting to killing your husband?" "I am," she said. "How did you do it?" "With an axe. While he was sleeping." Her voice was even devoid of any emotion. It was as if she were describing how to prune a vine. "Who else is buried out there?" Evans asked. Mary looked up at the ceiling for a moment, as if consulting a mental map. Then she began to list them. Names, dates, and locations. Carl Miller, Jane's husband. Sheriff Miller. The foreman, Mr. Davison. The trucker, Tom Jenkins. The Carter brothers. When she was finished, Evans had a list of 14 names. "Is that everyone?" he asked. "Yes," she said, "that's all of them." He lit a cigarette, his hand steady now. The shock had been replaced by a grim, chilling understanding. "Why?" he finally asked. Mary looked him directly in the eye, and for the first time, he saw something flicker in their depths. "They deserved it," she said. "Every last one of them." "Including your husband?" "Especially him," she replied. And then she told him everything. She spoke of the years of beatings, the broken bones, the constant fear. She told him about Sheriff Miller and his abuse of the town's women, about the foreman who brutalized his workers, about the trucker who had destroyed a 14-year-old girl's life and walked away without consequence. For everybody in the ground, there was a story of a crime that had gone unpunished. "Do you think you had the right to be their judge?" Evans asked quietly. Mary's reply was cold and simple. "Who else was there to judge them? The law? It took bribes. The church? It told us to pray. The town? It looked away. There was no one to protect us, so we protected ourselves." The trial of Mary Asher and Jane Miller was held that September in the Harmony Creek Town Hall. The small building was packed to the rafters. People came from all over the county, drawn by the gruesome, unbelievable story. Mary and Jane sat together, silent, behind a wooden barrier. The prosecutor spent 3 hours reading the charges. 14 counts of first-degree murder. The evidence was overwhelming. He showed photographs of the excavation, of the skeletons, intertwined with the roots of the vines. He read from the coroner's report, a dry, clinical account of crushed skulls and broken bones. The courtroom was silent, suffocating. Then came the witnesses. Annie Bell, now 18, took the stand. She spoke of the night she was attacked by Tom Jenkins and how Sheriff Miller had told her to be quiet, that she was to blame. At the end of her testimony, she looked at Mary and Jane. "They did what the law should have done," she said, her voice shaking but clear. An old man who had known the women his whole life testified. "I ate those grapes," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I fed them to my grandchildren. What am I supposed to tell them now?" He paused, looking at the judge. "But I will say this. I knew the men they buried. I knew what they were. We all knew. And we all stayed silent. So now we act surprised this happened?" The wife of Sheriff Miller testified. She looked directly at Mary. "You killed my husband," she said. Mary nodded. "He was not a good man. I knew that. But he was my husband." She paused, taking a breath. "I don't forgive you, but I understand why you did it." In her final statement, Jane wept, begging for forgiveness. But when it was Mary's turn, she stood tall and faced the packed room. "I don't regret a single one," she said, her voice clear and strong. "My husband beat me for 7 years. Sheriff Miller preyed on women. Mr. Davison crippled his workers. We are here on trial because when we were being beaten and humiliated and terrorized, you all looked away. You said it wasn't your business, so we made it our business. We did the dirty work that none of you had the courage to do." She sat down. The silence in the room was absolute. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. The verdict was read. For Jane Miller, whose role was seen as lesser, who had shown remorse, life in prison. For Mary Asher, the unrepentant killer, death by electrocution. Mary Asher was executed in December of 1971. She had no family left to claim her body. She was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery. Jane Miller died in prison 12 years later from pneumonia. Shortly before her death, she wrote a letter to the people of Harmony Creek, begging for their forgiveness, admitting that no one has the right to play God. The vineyard was never replanted. The land was plowed over, but no one would farm it. It became a fallow field, overgrown with weeds and thorns, a haunted place on the edge of town that children whispered about. The story of the graveyard vineyard became a dark legend, a chilling piece of local folklore. The questions it raised, however, never went away. Was this the story of two monstrous killers? Or was it the story of a justice system so broken that it forced its victims to become executioners? It's a story about what happens when good people stay silent in the face of evil, when a community chooses to look away. Because evil doesn't just appear out of nowhere. It grows slowly, like a vine, putting down roots in soil that has been fertilized by fear and indifference. And one day, it bears fruit, sweet, perhaps, but born of a terrible darkness. The land where the vineyard once stood is barren now, but if you listen closely on a quiet night, some say you can still hear the whispers of the secrets it keeps buried, a permanent reminder that the sweetest fruit can sometimes grow from the most bitter roots.